In 1611, the world's first purpose-built stock exchange opened in Amsterdam, but it didn't just trade spices, it traded the soul of national sovereignty. Imagine a company so wealthy that its valuation, adjusted for today's inflation, hit $7.9 trillion. That isn't just a number. It's a shadow that dwarfs the combined market caps of Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. This was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. While every other merchant in Europe was scrambling for scraps, the VOC was busy building the first corporate monster, a company state that possessed the legal right to wage war, strike its own coins, and execute anyone who stood in the way of its profit margins. You are currently living inside the sequel to this 400-year-old heist. The mechanism that allowed the VOC to swallow the Dutch Republic is the exact same blueprint being used to hollow out the United States today. We call it lobbying. They called it the Heren 16th. We call it private military contracting. They called it a private navy. As we hurtle toward 2026, we are approaching a financial event horizon where the corporation no longer influences the state. It replaces it. This is the corporate coup, and if you look at your bank account, you'll realize you aren't a citizen in this new world. You're an unsecured creditor to a failing empire. The historical bridge is terrifyingly precise. Think back to the Roman debasement of the denarius. As the silver content dropped, the state's power shifted into the hands of private estate owners who could afford their own protection. Fast forward to the current American stressor, the debt maturity wall. Between now and 2026, billions in corporate debt must be rolled over at interest rates that are no longer free. According to recent FDIC reports, U.S. banks are sitting on over $500 billion in unrealized losses. The IMF and the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, have already flagged a hidden $80 trillion mountain of off-balance sheet debt in FX swaps. We are repeating the VOC's fatal error of paying dividends with borrowed money while the underlying infrastructure rots. The year 2026 stands as the flashpoint because it marks the convergence of three systemic collapses. First, the erosion of federal regulatory power, accelerated by recent court rulings that stripped agencies of their oversight. Second, the handoff of public digital spaces, our town squares and financial ledgers, to private algorithms that owe no allegiance to the Constitution. Third, the massive accumulation of corporate debt that is now too big to fail, forcing the Federal Reserve into a corner where it must choose between saving the currency or saving the companies that own the politicians. The VOC didn't die overnight. It spent decades as a zombie company, using its sovereign powers to mask the fact that it was bankrupt. It eventually forced the state to assume its massive liabilities in 1799, a move that crippled the Dutch economy for a generation. That is the trap. We are being conditioned to believe that the survival of these $3 trillion titans is synonymous with the survival of America. But history is screaming a different truth. When the company becomes the state, the people become the inventory. The $7.9 trillion ghost isn't just a historical curiosity. It is a preview of the 2026 American reality. In 1602, the Dutch spice trade was a chaotic mess of voorcompagnieën, small, aggressive pre-companies that were effectively cannibalizing their own profit margins. It was a race to the bottom. Merchant ships were tripping over each other in the East Indies, driving up the purchase price of pepper at the source while flooding the market in Amsterdam. It was classic market saturation, and it was headed for a total wipeout. Enter Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the most powerful man in the Dutch Republic. He didn't believe in the invisible hand of the market. He believed in the iron fist of the state. He forced these competing factions into a shotgun marriage, creating a single, unified entity, the VOC. This wasn't a merger of equals. It was the birth of a monopoly designed to act as a paramilitary extension of the government. To make this work, the Dutch state handed the VOC a 21-year sovereign charter that should chill the blood of any modern citizen. This document didn't just give them an exclusive right to trade, it gave them the legal authority to wage war, build fortresses, strike their own currency, and, most disturbingly, execute prisoners without a trial. The VOC wasn't just a business anymore. It was a floating nation-state that answered to no one but its board of directors. They had successfully privatized the most sacred functions of government. When a VOC captain ordered a hanging in the Spice Islands, he wasn't acting as a criminal. He was acting as the law. This was the monopoly blueprint, the realization that the highest form of profit is only possible when you own the legal system itself. Now, look at the modern American mirror. We don't call them charters anymore. We call them terms of service and statutory immunities. The most glaring parallel is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Just as the VOC was granted immunity from the consequences of its violence to ensure trade dominance, modern tech giants have been granted a unique legal shield that no other industry possesses. They govern digital territories, where billions of people live their daily lives, and within these territories, the company's algorithm is the supreme judge, jury, and executioner. If you get deplatformed, you lose your business, your social standing, and your voice. There is no due process. There is only the platform sovereignty of a board of directors. By 2026, this sovereignty has matured into something even more pervasive. We are seeing the rise of private digital jurisdictions, where tech companies are increasingly taking over functions that used to belong to local governments. Everything from private policing in smart cities to the management of public infrastructure via proprietary software. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a business model. When a company controls the data, the currency, and the rules of the town square, they don't need to lobby the government. They are the government. The VOC showed us that once a corporation is granted the power to bypass the law, it will eventually seek to become the law. We are currently watching the final pages of that blueprint being executed in real time across the American landscape. In 1602, the VOC didn't just invent a company. They invented a financial trap that we are still stepped in today. It was the birth of the first initial public offering, IPO. Before this, companies were temporary. You pooled money for one voyage, and when the ship came back, you split the spoils and went home. The VOC changed the math. They created a permanent capital. Once you put your money in, you can't just take it out. You had to sell your share to someone else on the newly created Amsterdam Stock Exchange. This was the moment the link between a company's actual physical assets and its perceived value was severed forever. It turned ownership into a game of musical chairs. But there was a poison pill in the fine print. The VOC created a two-tiered class system, the Bewindhebbers, the elite directors who called every shot, and the Participanten, the ordinary investors who provided the cash but had zero say in how the company was run. The directors lived in opulence, secretively managing the books, while the investors were kept in a perpetual state of "trust us." This wasn't a partnership. It was a lopsided extraction of public wealth. The directors weren't accountable to the people who funded them. They were a self-appointed oligarchy, protected by the state, using other people's money to build a private empire. This sparked the world's first case of corporate whistleblowing. Isaac Lemaire, a massive investor who saw the rot from the inside, launched a rebellion. He accused the directors of cooking the books, hiding losses, and manipulating share prices to enrich themselves, while the common investor bled out. Lemaire realized that the VOC was more interested in maintaining the illusion of wealth than actually generating it. He became the first corporate activist, fighting a system that was designed to be a black box. But the VOC didn't fix the transparency. They crushed the critic. They used their sovereign power to ban Lemaire from trading, proving that in a company state, the truth is whatever the board of directors says it is. Fast forward to the modern U.S. markets, and you'll see Lemaire's ghost screaming in the boardrooms of Silicon Valley. We have resurrected this two-tier system through dual-class share structures. When you buy a share of Meta or Google, you aren't buying a vote. You're buying a ticket to a show where the ending is already written. Founders like Mark Zuckerberg hold Class B shares that carry 10 times the voting power of your Class A shares. They can own a minority of the equity, but maintain 100% of the control. This is the death of corporate democracy in America. It's a return to the Windhebers model, where a handful of individuals govern digital territories larger than most nations, completely insulated from the shareholders who supposedly own them. The transparency trap is closing again as we head toward 2026. Just as the VOC hid its mounting debts behind the glory of its spice monopoly, modern tech and finance giants are using complex accounting and non-GAAP earnings to mask the instability of their leveraged balance sheets. According to recent SEC filings, the gap between reported profits and actual cash flow is widening at an alarming rate. We are living in a market where the optics of growth are more important than the reality of solvency. When the directors own the votes and the books are a black box, the ordinary investor isn't a partner. They are the exit liquidity for the elite. The financial system is designed to keep you in the dark, but history provides the map to escape the trap. If this insight opened your eyes, hit the like button to help us break through the noise. Share this with someone who needs to see the patterns before the next collapse. And subscribe to master the mechanics of wealth that they don't want you to understand. Don't let your purchasing power disappear in silence. Drop a comment below, and let's discuss the truth the 1% ignores. By the 1620s, the VOC had reached a chilling conclusion. The most efficient way to maximize a dividend isn't through innovation, but through total elimination. Enter John Peterson Cohen, the Governor General whose name belongs in the darkest chapters of human history. Cohen's philosophy was blunt. Trade cannot be maintained without war, nor war without trade. He wasn't a soldier. He was a CEO with a naval fleet. When the people of the Banda Islands tried to sell their nutmeg to the English, violating the Dutch monopoly, Cohen didn't just fine them, he orchestrated a genocide. Out of a population of 15,000, barely 1,000 survived his purge. The VOC replaced the locals with slave labor to ensure that every single nut harvested was a Dutch nut. The analysis of this business model is brutal. The VOC didn't compete on price or quality. They competed on violence. To keep global prices high, they would intentionally burn massive warehouses filled with cloves and nutmeg, creating an artificial scarcity that forced European consumers to pay a premium. They realized it was more profitable to destroy the supply than to let the market find its own level. This wasn't capitalism, it was extraction by fire. The company's overhead was largely its military budget, and the investors in Amsterdam were more than happy to ignore the smell of smoke as long as the 18% dividend hit their accounts. Fast forward to the modern era, and the company state has simply swapped sails for satellites. We are watching the evolution of a military-industrial corporate complex, where U.S. foreign policy frequently reads like a corporate procurement list. Look at the scramble for lithium in South America, or the shifting alliances in the Middle East. These aren't just diplomatic maneuvers, they are resource acquisitions. Just as the VOC used its private navy to secure the spice routes, we are seeing the rise of private security firms and contractors acting as proxy armies for multinational interests. According to recent Department of Defense reports, the ratio of contractors to active duty troops has surged to nearly 1-to-1 in certain conflict zones. This is the violence for dividends model updated for the 21st century. When a private corporation provides the intelligence, the logistics, and the boots on the ground for a national conflict, the line between public defense and private profit disappears. We are seeing a world where data is the new nutmeg, and the infrastructure required to extract it is increasingly guarded by entities that answer to a board, not a commander-in-chief. As we approach 2026, the push for resource security, whether it's rare earth minerals for EVs or undersea cable protection for the cloud, is pushing America into a VOC-style trap. We are deploying national power to protect private supply chains, and when the bill for that violence comes due, it's the taxpayer, not the shareholder, who gets stuck with the invoice. By the mid-17th century, the VOC was the most powerful entity on the planet. But beneath the gold leaf and the massive dividends, a terminal cancer was spreading. The private trade. The company's internal structure was a masterclass in bad incentives. VOC employees, from the lowliest clerks to the high-ranking governor-generals, were paid peanuts compared to the value of the cargo they handled. Imagine a sea captain responsible for a ship carrying $10 million worth of cinnamon being paid a salary that barely covered his rent in Amsterdam. The result was inevitable. To survive and thrive, every single employee developed a side hustle. This wasn't just a few boxes of cloves missing from the warehouse. It was a systemic gutting of the company. It became an open secret that the VOC paid for the ships, the cannons, and the soldiers, while the employees used those very same ships to move their own private inventory. They would buy the highest quality spices at the source using the company's money, then sell them under the table and pocket the difference. By the time the official company cargo reached the docks in Europe, it was often the low-grade leftovers. The institution was footing the bill for the risk and the violence, but the individuals at the top were skimming the rewards. This wasn't a malfunction of the system. It was the system. Now look at the private trade of modern Washington, D.C. We don't smuggle cinnamon in the hulls of ships anymore. We smuggle influence through the revolving door. The parallel is staggering. You have regulators at the FDA, the SEC, or the EPA who are paid modest government salaries while overseeing industries worth trillions. They pass favorable legislation or look the other way on safety violations, and like clockwork, they retire from public service only to land seven-figure board seats at the very companies they were supposed to be policing. The public pays for the regulatory infrastructure, but the individuals in charge pocket the payout once they switch jerseys. The institutional rot goes even deeper with the normalization of insider trading within the halls of Congress. Just as VOC officials use their insider knowledge of spice harvests to front-run the market, modern lawmakers are frequently caught trading stocks in sectors they directly oversee. According to data tracked over the last 18 months, numerous members of Congress have outperformed the S&P 500, often making perfectly timed trades just days before major policy shifts or defense contract announcements. This is the 21st century side hustle. As we stare down 2026, this private trade cancer has created a government that is effectively a subsidiary of the corporate state. When the people responsible for the public interest have their true loyalty tied to their next corporate gig, the concept of a representative democracy becomes a ghost story. We are repeating the VOC's collapse of integrity. When the individuals running the machine realize they can make more money by breaking it than by fixing it, the machine is already dead. By the late 1700s, the VOC had entered what financial historians call its Ponzi phase. The math was no longer working. New competitors, specifically the British East India Company, were outmaneuvering the Dutch in the high-volume tea and textile markets. Trade margins were cratering, and the company's overhead, the cost of maintaining its private army and fortresses, was astronomical. Any sane board of directors would have cut the payout to save the ship. But the Huron 17th knew that the moment they touched the dividend, the illusion of invincibility would shatter. So for decades, they maintained a staggering 18% annual dividend while the company was actually bleeding cash. To keep the lights on, they turned to the 18th century version of creative accounting. They began treating non-liquid, depreciating military assets, like sinking warships and crumbling stone forts in Indonesia, as assets on the balance sheet to offset their mounting losses. When even that wasn't enough, they resorted to anticipatie penningen, short-term, high-interest loans. They were literally borrowing money from the public to pay interest to their shareholders. It was a death spiral disguised as a success story. They weren't a trading company anymore. They were a debt management firm that happened to own a few spice warehouses. This is exactly where the American corporate machine finds itself as we approach 2026. For the last decade, we have lived through a stock buyback epidemic that mirrors the Dutch dividend trap. Between 2010 and 2022, U.S. firms took advantage of historically low interest rates to borrow trillions of dollars. But they didn't use that cheap money to build new factories or fund breakthrough R&D. Instead, they used it to buy back their own shares, artificially inflating the stock price and triggering massive bonuses for executives. According to recent data, S&P 500 companies spent over $900 billion on buybacks in a single year, even as their actual productivity stagnated. We are now living in a zombie corporate economy. A zombie company is an entity that doesn't earn enough profit to cover the interest on its debt, staying alive only by continually refinancing that debt. As interest rates have climbed in 2024 and 2025, the cost of keeping these zombies on life support has become unbearable. We are staring at a liquidity crunch, where the companies that use debt to fake prosperity are finally running out of road. Just as the VOC used its sovereign status to hide the fact that it was a hollowed-out shell, modern American titans are using their too-big-to-fail status as a shield. They've bet that the government won't let them collapse because the fallout would be too messy. But history shows that when you pay dividends with debt, you aren't building a future. You're just selling off the pieces of the ship to keep the furnace burning. By 2026, the furnace is going to run cold. By the mid-17th century, the global market underwent a seismic shift that the VOC simply refused to acknowledge. For over a century, they had dominated the world by controlling high-margin, low-volume luxuries like nutmeg and cloves. They were the masters of the spice lane. But the world was moving on. The new money wasn't in exotic seasonings. It was in mass-market commodities, tea, coffee, and textiles. The British East India Company, EIC, saw the writing on the wall and pivoted, building a lean, agile supply chain designed for volume. Meanwhile, the VOC remained trapped in its own success. They were a bloated bureaucracy weighed down by the massive costs of their private islands and aging fortresses. They were essentially the Kodak of the 18th century, clinging to a film business model while the rest of the world was going digital. This stagnation wasn't just a failure of imagination, it was a failure of structure. The VOC was so deeply integrated into the Dutch state that it couldn't change without threatening the entire national economy. They stayed in the spice lane because they had already paid for the lanes. They kept doubling down on expensive military enforcement of spice monopolies, while the British were busy making a fortune on everyday consumer goods. By the time the Dutch directors realized that tea was the future, the British already owned the gardens. The VOC had become too heavy to move, a corporate dinosaur watching the climate change in real time. Today, the United States is staring at its own spice lane moment. For 80 years, our economic monopoly has been the US dollar and the SWIFT payment system. It's a high-margin business that allows us to export inflation and command the global financial architecture. But just as the VOC ignored the shift to commodities, we are seeing a massive volume-driven pivot toward alternative payment systems and the rise of the BRICS nations. Countries like China, India, and Brazil are no longer content to trade in our currency lane. They are building their own infrastructure, cross-border digital currencies, and commodity-backed trade loops that bypass the dollar entirely. The analysis for 2026 is clear. The U.S. monopoly is being challenged by more agile Eastern markets that prioritize volume and speed over the maintenance of an aging imperial standard. According to recent reports from the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, the share of non-dollar reserves in global central banks has hit a multi-decade low. We are clinging to the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, while the rest of the world is building a new financial internet. If we don't pivot, if we continue to use our currency as a weapon of war rather than a tool of trade, we risk becoming the bloated bureaucracy of the 21st century. The lesson of the VOC is that a monopoly doesn't protect you from a changing world. It just makes the eventual collapse much louder. In 1780, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War provided the final, brutal stress test for the VOC's company-state model. It was the moment the music finally stopped. The British Royal Navy didn't just win a few battles. They established a suffocating blockade that sliced through the VOC's global trade arteries like a scalpel. Suddenly, the company that had spent 2 centuries acting like a sovereign nation realized it had no backup plan. It had no national treasury to fall back on, no loyal citizenry to rally, only a fleet of rotting ships and a mountain of unpaid debt. When the spice ships couldn't reach Amsterdam, the Ponzi phase we discussed earlier hit a wall. The VOC couldn't borrow more money to pay its old debts. And for the first time in history, the world's most powerful corporation was exposed as a hollowed-out shell. By 1795, the situation was terminal. The Dutch Republic had been replaced by the Batavian Republic under French influence, and the new government walked into the VOC's headquarters to find a catastrophe. The books didn't just show a loss, they showed a black hole. In 1799, the state was forced to formally dissolve the company and nationalize its remains. This was the birth of the too big to fail doctrine. The Dutch government had to swallow 120 million guilders in corporate debt, a sum so massive it effectively crippled the nation's finances for decades. The taxpayer was forced to pay for the private trade, the corruption, and the failed dividends of an elite board of directors. The public's reaction was visceral. The acronym VOC was mockingly rechristened Vergen onder corruptie, perished under corruption. The parallel to the current American stressor is a one-to-one match. Look at the too big to fail bailouts of 2008, and more importantly, the quiet, massive interventions we've seen in 2023 and 2024. When Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank buckled, the Federal Reserve didn't just follow the rules. They invoked a systemic risk exception to protect uninsured depositors. According to recent FDIC data, the banking system is currently carrying over $500 billion in unrealized losses due to rising interest rates. Just as the VOC's private debt became the Dutch state's public burden, we are seeing a socialization of losses where the risks taken by massive financial institutions are backstopped by the American public. We are entering the 2026 flashpoint, where the company state reaches its logical conclusion. The U.S. national debt is now over $34 trillion, and a significant portion of that is the result of absorbing corporate and financial instability. When a system is designed so that the gains are private but the losses are public, the incentive to be honest vanishes. We are currently living through the Vergen onder corruptie phase of the American experiment. The hidden $80 trillion FX swap debt, flagged by the BIS, isn't just a number, it's a fuse. When that fuse hits the 2026 debt wall, the question won't be whether the companies survive. It will be whether the country can survive the cost of saving them one last time. As we stand here in early 2026, we are no longer looking at a theoretical future crisis. We are staring at the math. The convergence is here. The primary driver is the debt maturity wall. Between now and the end of the year, over $2 trillion in corporate debt, much of it taken out when interest rates were near zero, must be refinanced. But the era of cheap money is dead. The Federal Reserve's battle with persistent inflation has pinned rates at levels these zombie companies cannot survive. We are seeing a massive spike in corporate defaults, and according to the latest Bloomberg data, the distressed debt market has swollen to levels not seen since the 2008 crash. The VOC's Anticipatiepenningen have come due, and the American corporate ledger is bleeding. But the 2026 convergence isn't just about balance sheets. It's about a fundamental shift in who actually runs the country. This is the governance shift. The corporate coup isn't a military takeover with tanks in the streets. It's a quiet, digital handover of the keys. By 2026, the critical infrastructure of American life, our energy grids, our financial ledgers, and even our truth through AI-driven information flows, is almost entirely owned and operated by a handful of private entities. When a government outsources its defense to private contractors, its currency to digital platforms, and its law enforcement to automated algorithms, it ceases to be a sovereign state. It becomes a landlord for a collection of company towns. The breaking point arrives when the sovereign debt of the United States collides with these private sector liabilities. Just as the Batavian Republic was forced to swallow the VOC's 120 million guilders of debt in 1795, the U.S. Treasury is being backed into a corner. We are facing a sovereign debt crisis where the interest payments on our $34 trillion national debt now exceed our entire defense budget. When the next round of too-big-to-fail corporations begins to buckle under the 2026 maturity wall, the government will be forced to choose. Let the pillars of the American economy collapse, or print the money to save them and risk a total currency meltdown. This is the Batavian trap. In 1795, the Dutch thought they were saving their economy by nationalizing the VOC. Instead, they anchored their future to a corpse. We are currently watching the same mechanism unfold. The outsourcing of state functions to for-profit giants has created a system where the company state is too integrated to be allowed to die, but too corrupt to be allowed to lead. By 2026, the line between the public interest and private profit hasn't just been blurred, it has been erased. We aren't just repeating history, we are accelerating it toward a climax that will redefine what it means to be a citizen in a corporate-owned world. The Dutch East India Company didn't fail because it lacked power. It failed because it had too much of it. For 200 years, the VOC was a monster with no moral guardrails, a precursor to the modern multinational that believed it could outrun reality through sheer force. They thought they could replace the laws of economics with the roar of cannons and the secrecy of a closed boardroom. But the lesson of 1799 is clear. Eventually, mathematics beats gunpowder. You cannot borrow your way to prosperity forever, and you cannot run a civilization on the private trade of an unaccountable elite. The VOC didn't just go bankrupt, it became a cautionary tale of what happens when a corporation consumes the state that gave it life. We are now standing at the exact same crossroads. As we enter 2026, the American experiment is being tested by the same company-state model that destroyed the Dutch Republic. We see it in the $34 trillion national debt, the $80 trillion in hidden FX swaps, and the hollowing out of our public institutions by the revolving door of corporate interests. We are living through a slow rot of debt-funded dividends and a systemic neglect of the infrastructure that actually keeps a nation alive. The question isn't whether the corporate coup is happening. The question is whether we have the courage to stop it. This is the moment of choice. Does America continue down the path of the VOC, allowing its sovereignty to be auctioned off to the highest bidder until the state is nothing more than a debt collection agency for private titans? Or do we reclaim our governance? Breaking the cycle requires more than just better regulations. It requires a fundamental rejection of the too-big-to-fail theology. It means demanding transparency in our financial ledgers, ending the legalized bribery of lobbying, and ensuring that no corporation, no matter how many trillions it controls, is ever allowed to act as a sovereign power. The 2026 debt wall is a mirror. It shows us a reflection of 1799, warning us that the socialization of corporate losses is a suicide pact for the middle class. History is not a straight line. It is a series of loops. We have seen this financial mechanism before, and we know exactly how the story ends if it isn't interrupted. The ghost of the $7.9 trillion company is whispering to us from the docks of old Amsterdam, reminding us that when the company becomes the state, the people are the first thing to be liquidated. The ship is sinking, and the lifeboats are being reserved for the board of directors. But the power to change the ending still rests in the hands of those who refuse to be inventory. The corporate coup only succeeds if we continue to mistake their profits for our progress. It's time to stop funding the ghost and start rebuilding the country.